We're going to talk about the FY23 contracts and opportunities. What I wanted to begin with, and I apologize, I'm going to be talking fast. Everyone tells me I talk like I drive fast. But we're getting kind of short on time, so I will talk a little faster than I probably should. But I want to set the stage first and foremost to talk about funding levels, our appropriations. So typically the SNS gets two types of appropriations, our annual year and then supplemental funding. And on the screen right here, you'll see annual appropriations on your left, and then the supplemental COVID and pandemic appropriations on your right. The annual appropriations, we just did a little snapshot about 5 years ago, so starting in 2018, and you can see in 2020, and then again in 2022, we got some, what we would consider substantial increases. In FY 2023, the President's budget is $975 million. However, if history has it, we will not get that amount. Congress typically approves something much lower than that. What I want to make you aware of is it will cost us in FY23 $1.8 billion to sustain what we currently have in our inventory. That does not include anything we bought for COVID. So our CBRNE threats, our chemical, our biological, radiological, nuclear, and explosive. So we have to make the decision, or the powers that be have to make the decision every year, what 40% of everything that we need, what are we going to buy? What are we going to put our money towards? And so that's a very difficult choice. So as you can see, historically, we've been underfunded. Additionally, in FY22, our operating costs, so the cost for staffing, warehousing, transportation, and others, was just over $500 million. So that left us with less than $340 million to protect the nation against all CBRNE threats. Again, this does not include anything COVID or pandemic related. If you look over at the COVID and pandemic appropriations, you'll see that in 2020 we got just over $10.7 billion in appropriations, and then another $1.9 billion in 2021. We have obligated nearly all of the 2020 funding, and we do have roughly $1.9 billion remaining to sustain the future procurements, the warehousing, and everything else we have to do through FY24. Speaking of FY24, that is when our current COVID appropriations ends. We do not have any appropriations or funding anticipated after that. We've been told that we have to sustain our COVID and our pandemic preparedness with our annual appropriations. Without a significant increase in annual appropriations, we'll be unable to do so, or we'll have to make drastic decisions on what we do fund. We purchased of the $10.7 billion, or roughly $8 billion of this was COVID supplies and pharmaceuticals. So what I want to get into now is, this is again a copy of Brian's slide, but I wanted to touch on something here. $13 billion in inventory. Let's say an average, a product expires every 5 years. That means every year I need a minimum of $2.6 billion to sustain both our CBRNE and our COVID and pandemic threats. And that doesn't even include our operating cost, the additional cost for warehouses. Remember, it was just $500 million for CBRNE. Can you imagine how much more it is for the pandemic things? Again, we do not have sufficient money. And just a quick recap, what we hold as MCMs in our inventory, the category A threat agents, right? Smallpox, anthrax, botulism, plague, tularemia, chemical nerve agents, and so forth. So I want to show this slide real quick. This shows you the SNS Formulary by threat. It shows you what prophy response and the treatment courses that we use. One of the unique ones, as we said, with every response, we evolve. So we kind of touched on Ebola and how we evolved. We were buying Tyvek suits and other things. One other unique thing is that Ebola never kind of went away. So we are now receiving the Ebola vaccine. The Ebola vaccine must be stored at negative 70 degrees Celsius. Or we have a substantial amount of Ebola vaccine destined to be in. So we've been building up those capabilities. However, Jynneos vaccine, that is also supposed to be stored long-term at negative 70 to 80 degrees Celsius. And if you are not aware, it takes time, it takes money, and it takes effort to try to build out those capabilities. You all, the industry, does not have, this is a very costly capability as well. You all do not have hundreds of pallets of spaces worth to store our product at. Neither do we. And so it's very difficult when we just found out that we're going to have to store Jynneos here in the middle of 2023 to quickly act. What are we going to do? We're going to modify our GSA contracts? We're going to contract out with commercial industry? Are we going to ask you guys to build out the capability? Or is it a mix of both? Also, as you read through these, think about who else buys these products. Most of these products were developed with US government funding, research and development. We are likely one of, if not the only, buyer of some of these products, or maybe 99%. With such, it gets very costly as well. So, again, I want to talk about the formulary. How does something get added to the SNS formulary? There are two ways, non-emergency and emergency. For non-emergency, the Department of Homeland Security will conduct an analysis and issue a material threat determination. HHS would then perform population modeling to determine how many citizens to protect against that said threat. Our FEMC group would then identify the medical countermeasures that we need to protect against the threat. And then you have additional considerations. So you have manufacturing capacity, budget, and ease of administration of that pharmaceutical or medical countermeasure. BARDA may develop these medical countermeasures, at which point the SNS would procure, sustain, obtain, and put into inventory that finished product. Or if it's already commercially available, the SNS would look to buy it out in the industry. Again, if we have sufficient funding. For the emergency process, this would be need-based. Again, I'm going back to Ebola. That's when we were asked to stockpile or acquire called PAPRs, Powered Air Purifying Respirator Systems, and different types of Tyvek suits. For such instances, supplemental funding would often be required to procure these products. So before I show you the list of potentials for FY23, I want to make a disclaimer. As you guys are aware, like many civilian government agencies, we're currently under a continuing resolution. We do not have an approved budget. We do not know how much funding and what we'll be able to buy next year. Upon Congress and the President approving the FY23 budget and the SNS receiving its annual appropriations, we then coordinate with HHS and others to determine which requirements we're going to support. With all of the uncertainty that exists, the following list represent what we may potentially buy. Again, I told you, 1.8 billion, we may not even get 800 to 900 million. So half, we may be able to buy half of our seed burning requirements. If the funding remains the same as the fiscal year 2022, the SNS would be unable to procure less than half of what we need. So I'm going to start by services. We contract for transportation services every year. We use multiple means. We have multiple requirements. So many of you may be familiar with the NGDS, the Next Generation Delivery Service. That is a mandated schedule for small parcel, small package shipments. So anything 150 pounds or less, we have to, by law, utilize that. We also utilize the GSA transportation schedule. Additionally, the SNS currently has an SNS BPA with multiple vendors awarded under it. Everybody has a unique capability to them. Historically, we've also had air transportation support. However, over the past several years, it became extremely costly, and our commercial partners no longer wanted to support that effort. Here again, you will see the vendor-managed inventory and distribution. So we immediately put in place, rapidly put in place those VMI distribution contracts during COVID. They have or are expiring, and we have to move that product somewhere. And we want to maintain that enhancement that we've built out. We also, as I mentioned earlier, we want to incorporate new types of VMI. What else can we benefit from? Is it a rotation? What can be best value to us? That's for both medical products and also pharmaceuticals. As I mentioned, ambient, refrigerated, cold chain, possibly ultra cold chain, controlled products. You name it, we'll have to do it. So warehousing. GSA holds the federal authority to enter into leases on behalf of the civilian government. So we utilize GSA for our 3PL warehousing. Product disposal. Obviously, product has shelf life. We have to rotate it. We have to sustain it. It'd be great if you guys could do that through your commercial industry. That would save us additional funding, additional cost. But as it may be, right now we bought a lot of product that expires over the next 5 years for COVID. And we're going to have to dispose of that product or find another mechanism or means to get rid of it. We have professional administrative support services. For those, we typically use the GSA schedule. We often go to small business and make it a set-aside or do a direct 8A award or an Alaskan Native or Native American awards. HHS, or ASPR I should say, also has both a professional and an administrative support. I believe it's an IDIQ that we tap into as well. Decontamination. So early on in the response, we identified the potential need with all the unknowns again. Was the product coming back to us contaminated? Could there be cross-contamination? If our folks go in to break down those kits and those caches, Will they end up with COVID? Well, it's not just for that. What about radiation? What about other things? So we continue to look at decontamination services for the caches and the kits that we deploy to the field. Then repackaging and kitting. So we told you we supported the federal national vaccine campaign, and they're going to need to sustain that. While we may not be doing the direct awards or contracts for that anymore, we are, again, continuing to support those efforts. We currently own and maintain that requirement. However, that is going to our fellow colleagues in another division within ASPR. So pharmaceuticals. Now, these are not all the pharmaceuticals we buy. We buy a lot of pharmaceuticals and need a lot of pharmaceuticals. These are just some of those, some of the big ones we could potentially buy next year. That is going to be more than likely commercially available. We are going to go out and post. We use two things for pharmaceuticals. We use the VA National Acquisition Center, that federal supply schedule, and then we'll go full and open. I'll give you a second to look at those. Once you get down to specialty products, those are typically your sole source requirements. You know, what we developed, what we invested money in research and development on. One of the unique things that I'll talk about as well is we talked about the NDMS, the National Disaster Medical System. That had hundreds, if not thousands, of pharmaceutical items, and we were procuring tons of small volume pharmaceuticals. Earlier this year, the NDMS went back to ASPR under the logistics organization. We no longer hold those caches and kits and no longer have that requirement. So we were back to stockpiling and procuring large volumes of pharmaceuticals. So MedSurge equipment and supplies. Unfortunately, for all of our MedSurge needs, for you all, we have a BPA, a multiple award BPA right now, and that does not end until September 26th. So if we do have a MedSurge need, and I believe those contract ceilings are $18 million or $20 million a piece. So if we do have a contract need, it does not ever exceed the ceiling, we will utilize those until 2026, in which case we'll recompete. On the books next year for potential procurement is equipment, infusion pumps, beds, and aspirators. There's also miscellaneous supplies, so temperature monitors, data loggers, cold chain shippers, and gel packs. We utilized a lot for Jynneos vaccine recently. Realized some of them getting old and we need more of them. So pandemic products. Now, this is not our CBRNE requirements. The first three I separated. So those are the most likely requirements that are going to continue to move forward. You may have seen one or two of those already solicited, and you may see amendments to those as well going forward. So isolation gowns level 2, surgical masks, and EHMRs, which we call, that's the acronym, elastomeric half mask respirators. If we had sufficient funding, we would replenish and sustain the quantities at the volumes that we currently procured and have in inventory for face shields, goggles, surgical gowns, level 3 and 4, nitrile gloves, and N95s. For N95s, we would continue to only look for FDA and NIOSH approved. We procured more than 24 pharmaceuticals for COVID. We would like to also sustain those. However, the cost for that would be well over $100 million every 2 years. Some of those pharmaceuticals are propofol, midazolam, fentanyl, rocuronium, lactated rigueurs, Zosyn, norepinephrine, cisatracarium, and heparin. Now the bottom three, test kits, therapeutics, and vaccine. The SNS does not directly procure those, or we may procure them, but a very, very small quantity, not into the millions, not even to the hundreds of thousands. So for test kits, I mentioned that earlier. Industrial Base Expansion Group is who is owning and running that mission set. We have our colleagues in the group called HCORE within ASPR, and they are leading the therapeutics. Right now, I believe they are going to, or are competing the future of the therapeutic via mine distribution under GSA. You then have the vaccine. Will the SNS procure the vaccine in the future? We don't know. Will the SNS hold an inventory of the vaccine in the future? Potentially. So with that, I hope you have a little bit of insight, understand our struggles, and that you get a little frustrated with us, as we're frustrated every year in trying to figure out and determine what we're really going to buy, and be able to communicate that to you all and have you all understand. So again, I hope today and this last few minutes were helpful. Please email us with any inquiries and your capability statements to the ASPR SNS Acquisitions branch box located here.